Welcome, friends. This is a web novel. Imagination is key to enjoy it fully. Please like, subscribe, and gives your feedback.
Days flew by. Sunny only had 4 weeks to prepare himself for the journey into the dream realm, so there wasn't even a minute to spare. He was relentless, pushing his body and mind to the limits in an attempt to absorb as much knowledge and skills as possible in that short amount of time. In the day, he studied with teacher Julius, slowly learning how to survive and take care of himself in the absence of civilization. Their lessons ranged from comparatively simple, like various ways to produce fire, to much more obscure and esoteric, like celestial navigation. What was so hard about celestial navigation? Well, as it turned out, the dream realm was not consistent in terms of star geography. Different regions had different stars and constellations, as well as a different number of moons. While the sun seemed to be the same, its behavior was highly unpredictable. Still, with sufficient knowledge, one could find ways to study the skies and subsequently navigate themselves. Most of these lessons were, supposedly, already included in the various school curriculums and known to the majority of sleepers. However, learning something from a textbook and learning the same thing from an actual awakened were two completely different matters. Teacher Julius had a habit of going much more in-depth when explaining his subject. Thanks to this time-consuming habit of his, Sunny not only learned about the what, but also often gained glimpses into the why. This nascent understanding of the underlying principles of the dream realm environments gave him the ability to face any situation with at least some measure of readiness. Even the lessons in dead languages, which Sunny had initially judged to be useless, turned out to be much more interesting than he could ever imagine. This was, in large part, because it concerned the spell itself. After all, the spell communicated with humans in one of those dead languages. By knowing the language, he was able to understand its various remarks and descriptions better. The simplest example of this was Nephi's and her true name, Changing Star. While technically correct, this translation failed to properly convey the exact meaning. By understanding the grammatical structure of the rune language, it was easy to extrapolate and see that the more correct translation would have been Star of Change. More than that, there were different runes for change, each with its own connotation. Depending on what exact rune was used to relay the meaning of the name, it could also mean ruinous star or star of misfortune. A small change in wording and connotation could mean a world of difference in real life. Sunny, who had never seriously studied before, found the process of acquiring vast amounts of theoretical knowledge strange, numbing, and exhausting. However, in a sense, it was also exhilarating. After all, knowledge was something that only the privileged had access to. It was also this authority over knowledge that kept them in the position of power, creating a vicious circle of inequality. The poor had no opportunity to study, and without the advantage of good education, they had no way to stop being poor. The weirdest part about all of this was that Sunny was now one of those privileged people. More than that, he was at the pinnacle of social hierarchy. Not only had he gained access to an unlimited amount of knowledge, but even his basic needs like food and shelter were also taken care of by the government, allowing him to fully focus on the single goal of developing himself as an awakened. This sudden transformation would have sent him into a whirlpool of philosophical reflection if he had any time to spare. But he didn't, because teacher Julius also insisted on holding practical lessons every other day. Even if some of them had to be done in virtual reality simulations, he insisted on using the full immersion stations with enhanced physical feedback. As a result, Sunny was bone-tired and utterly exhausted. The good thing was that with such amount of exercise, coupled with his newly reforged body, Sunny had never been in better shape. Even without combat training, he could feel his strength, stamina, and agility improving by leaps and bounds. Basically, the peculiar rebirth he had experienced after completing the first nightmare had enhanced the innate potential of his body, bringing it to the peak of the human condition. However, it was up to him to realize that potential with sweat, effort, and a lot of hard work. Practical application of wilderness survival techniques provided him with the opportunity to do so. And as though this wasn't enough, Sunny secretly collected information about other sleepers and practiced shadow control every night. His shadow was independent enough to be sent on scouting missions without his direct control. It would sneak here and there, listening in on the conversations and observing different classes where sleepers had to demonstrate their aspect abilities. Then, after Sunny had finished his supper and returned to his room, it would come back and share everything it had heard and seen during the day. The only problem with this arrangement was that the shadow, despite its outward snarkiness, turned out to be rather naive. It didn't quite understand how the human world worked, and as such, often failed to distinguish between useful information and meaningless chatter. So, most of the time, Sunny would receive nothing of value or juicy gossip instead of important secrets. This is how he learned that in the sleeper center, romance was in the air. After all, there were 100 beautiful young people locked underground in close proximity to each other, with the added spice of a deathly threat hanging above their heads. Many felt that life was short and it was their time to seize the day. Passion bloomed in the shadow of approaching danger. Sunny was excluded from this whole side of the thing, of course. Firstly, he had already positioned himself to be perceived as an unlikable lunatic. Secondly, he simply had no time for anything except for his lessons and training. And lastly, he was wary of getting too close to anybody, afraid that a situation would arise where he would have no choice but to divulge his true name. Apart from gathering information and slowly learning about the scope and details of various aspect abilities, and, to a lesser extent, flaws, he was also experimenting with shadow control. The results were very promising. He quickly found out that his shadow was able to enhance various objects and not only his body. If it wrapped itself around a weapon, the weapon strike harder and deliver more damage. If it was applied to an armor, the armor would become sturdier and harder to break. The enhancement was rather substantial, too. It was roughly twice as much as the initial value. All in all, this ability, if used correctly, could make him a powerhouse among the sleepers. Many combat aspects could deliver more speed or damage, many could provide more defense and protection, but none were as well-rounded and versatile as Shadow Slave. With the added utility of Shadow Sight, Shadow Step and Shadow Scout, it was truly incredible. Just like that, day after day passed, slowly turning into weeks. Before Sunny even knew it, the winter solstice was already here. On the day of the winter solstice, Sunny woke up feeling tired and drowsy. No matter how much he tried to shake off this listlessness, it wouldn't go away. In the end, he just stayed in the bed for a while, wrapping himself in a blanket. He was already familiar with this feeling of never-ending, ensnaring sleepiness. It was the same in the days before his first nightmare. It was also quite similar to what he had experienced while slowly dying of hypothermia on the slopes of the Black Mountain. Remembering the cold embrace of approaching death, Sunny couldn't help but shiver. This was his last day on Earth, at least for a while. By nightfall, the spell was going to take him away once again, this time to challenge the vast expanse of the dream realm. What was he going to face in that ruined magical world? Would luck be on his side this time, or would there be another disaster? Ugh. There was no point in guessing. He had already done everything in his power to prepare for the inevitable. He studied hard, trained hard, and kept his secret safe. His aspect was better than most, and his will to survive was long tempered by the harsh reality of the outskirts and the even harsher ordeal of the first nightmare. All in all, he was ready. With a sigh, Sunny got out of bed and went along with his morning routine. If this was going to be his last hot shower in a long while, he was going to really enjoy it. If it was going to be his last scrumptious breakfast for the time being. Actually, he had no appetite. The cafeteria was full of sleepers, but no one was talking. Everybody was in low spirits and seemed to be uncharacteristically introspective. There was no usual laughter or boisterous conversations, only the legacies remained calm and collected. However, even they kept to themselves. Sunny thought about the last time he was preparing to enter the spell and, with a bit of trepidation, approached the coffee machine. During his stay in the academy, he had long discovered that a lot of people were in a habit of adding sugar and milk to their coffee. So, on this auspicious day, he decided to give it another try. After all, it was nice to have a tradition. A few minutes later, he had taken his usual seat near Kasia, the blind girl. Despite their compulsory closeness, they had not talked to each other even once, just like two strangers forced to share the same space by circumstances beyond their control. Sunny did not see a reason for anything to change today. However, as soon as he took the first sip of coffee, Kasia suddenly turned her head and stared at him with her beautiful, blind blue eyes. Unnerved, Sunny looked around, checking if someone else had attracted her attention, and, after making sure that there wasn't anyone standing behind him, asked, What? Kasia was silent, as though hesitating if she should reply, and then suddenly said, Happy birthday. What? Sunny frowned, trying to comprehend the meaning behind her words. Then, a flash of surprise appeared on his face. Oh, right. It's my birthday today. He had completely forgotten about it. He was turning 17 today. Wait, how did she know about this? Sunny gave the blind girl a strange look, opened his mouth, and then decided to let the issue go. She was just too creepy. Thanks. With a nod, Kasia turned away and seemingly lost interest in having a conversation once again. Which was for the better. Sunny returned to his coffee, finding it not too bad this time. Of course, sugar and cream were making most of the work. However, he did feel a little bit more awake after drinking it. 17, huh? Sunny was never sure that he would make it to this age alive. And yet, despite everything, he did. Life was sure unpredictable sometimes. If anyone would have told him a year ago that he was going to celebrate his 17th birthday by drinking real coffee with real milk and sugar, he would have laughed in their face. But now it was a reality. Unwillingly, Sunny remembered all the people who used to celebrate his birthdays with him, a long time ago. Before his mood turned sour, he decisively dispelled these thoughts and forced himself to smile. This is not bad. Let's do it again next year, when I'm already an awakened. Cheering himself up like that, he finished his coffee and left the cafeteria. There were no classes today, but he still visited the wilderness survival classroom and said his goodbyes to teacher Julius. The old man got pretty emotional when sending him off. He gave Sunny one last tip a dozen or so times in a row and even promised to apply for a research assistant position to be opened after the young man had become a full awakened. Sunny left thanking him for his time and patience. After that, there wasn't much to do. When the sun was close to setting, Instructor Rock gathered them in the foyer of the sleeper center and led them outside. In the snowy parks that surrounded the white building, other awakened were leading their own batches of sleepers to the same destination. It was the Academy's medical center. The center looked more like a shrine than a hospital. Its interior contained both highly advanced technology as well as some of the best healers among the awakened. For the duration of their first journey into the dream realm, the bodies of sleepers would be kept safe in specially designed pods and sustained by the magical powers of those healers if anything unfortunate were to happen on the other side of the spell. Of course, whether or not they would wake up in the end wholly depended on the sleepers themselves. To Sunny's surprise, after entering the medical center, Instructor Rock did not take them directly to the wing containing sleeper pods. Instead, he led them to a comparatively deserted floor and then opened the doors to a spacious gallery that was brightly illuminated by the beautiful crimson rays of the setting sun. There, they saw rows and rows of wheelchairs. In each wheelchair, there was a person with a blank, strangely peaceful expression on their face. All these people were completely silent, motionless, and still. They did not show any reaction to the appearance of guests. They all seemed to be empty. In the eerie silence, Sunny felt his hair standing up and a creeping terror sipping deep into his heart. Instructor Rock looked at the empty people with solemn eyes. There is a reason I brought you all here. Look well and remember. Some of you may know who these people are, for those of you who don't, they are called Hollow. He gritted his teeth. Each one of them was once either a sleeper or an awakened. Some of them were weak, some of them were strong. Some were even incredibly powerful. All of them have perished in the dream realm. Their souls are gone, Sunny realized, horrified. If you're lucky, once your spirit is destroyed, your body dies with it. But if not, you'll become just like them. Hollow. Instructor Rock glanced in the direction where Castor and Nephi stood, and then added. So don't die out there. Half an hour later, sleepers had been led to their personal rooms and were preparing to enter the pods. In one of the rooms, the blind girl, Kasha, was helplessly trying to orient herself in the unfamiliar space, touching the walls and strange pieces of machinery with her hands. Tears were streaming down her beautiful, doll-like face. In the other room, proud Legacy Castor was staring listlessly at the floor. His lips were moving, repeating one strange phrase over and over again. He was trembling. Somewhere else, Changing Star Nephis, the last daughter of the Immortal Flame clan, was looking down at her hands. Underneath her skin, soft white radiance was slowly growing brighter and brighter. Her face was contorted in a grimace of harrowing agony. And finally, there was a room where Shadow Slave Sunless, lost from light, turned away from the sleeping pod and glanced down at his shadow. Well? Are you ready? The shadow shrugged and didn't answer. Sunny sighed. Yeah, me too. With that, he stepped forward and climbed into the pod. In the vast echoing darkness, he heard. Welcome to the Dream Realm, Sunless. Sunny was expecting to first look at the place where his arrival to the Dream Realm was going to take place from above, just like it had happened at the beginning of the first nightmare. Back then, time had magically moved in reverse, giving him an opportunity to see hints of what he was going to face. Instead, immediately after hearing the greetings of the spell, Sunny found himself blind and drowning. As he instinctively tried to open his mouth to scream, salty water rushed inside, making him choke and twitch. More than that, he couldn't see anything. No, it's not that he couldn't see, it's just there was no source of light around. Usually, darkness wasn't a problem for Sunny, but, for some reason, his sight wasn't working anymore. Maybe the seawater he was submerged in was blocking it. If it wasn't for the special space perception that the affinity to shadows gave him, he would have been completely disoriented. With its help, though, he barely managed to understand which side was down, and which side was up. Luckily, Teacher Julius's lessons had included swimming. Swearing to thank both the old man and Master Jet once he came back, Sunny forced himself to stay calm and began to swim upward. In a few long and tense seconds, his head broke through the surface of the water. Sunny was finally able to draw in a deep, hoarse breath. Breathe, breathe. You're still alive. After sucking in enough air to soothe his burning lungs and compose himself to a certain degree, Sunny carefully spun in the water, trying to take in his surroundings. What met him was an endless, jet-black expanse of undulating waves. Above them was an empty black sky. There was no moon, no stars, just a dark vastness of repressive nothingness. Sunny blinked a few times, cold dread taking hold of his heart. This is a sea? An ocean? Was I dropped in the middle of an ocean? No, it couldn't be. There had to be solid ground somewhere nearby. As he was gripped by a momentary panic, a remote sound suddenly drew his attention. Sunny turned around and saw a triangular dorsal fin moving in his direction. Luckily, it was still hundreds and hundreds of meters away. Wait, if it's so far away, then how come I can see it so clearly? Despite being submerged in water, Sunny still felt like there was suddenly cold sweat all over his body. By his estimation, that dorsal fin was at least 5 meters tall. It was rapidly approaching, growing visibly larger with each second. Damn you, spell. With eyes full of horror, Sunny spun again, desperately trying to find something, anything, to save him. And there, a short distance away, he finally noticed a black mass protruding slightly above the water. Not wasting even a second on thinking, he started to swing his arms and legs, swimming in the direction of the black mass with a considerable speed. However, no matter how fast he swam, the giant shadow of the unknown creature was closing the distance between them much faster. A small part of Sunny's mind managed to preserve its rationality even when faced with this boundless, primal fear. Not allowing himself to slip entirely into panic, Sunny tried to think, and then silently commanded his own shadow to wrap itself around his body. Instantly, his speed increased twofold. Just seconds before the unknown colossus got to him, Sunny reached the black mass, stretched out his hands, and pulled himself out of the water. He rolled away from the edge, scratching his skin on the uneven rocks, and jumped in fright when the whole surface underneath him shuddered, as though something massive had collided with it. As Sunny backed out, terrifying jaws appeared from the water, with rows and rows of giant teeth, each one as long as he was tall. He opened his eyes wide, understanding that the rock he had climbed on was not tall enough to save him from the monster. Why is it even trying to eat me? I'm too small to be considered a filling snack for something this enormous. However, before the monster had a chance to attack, a colossal tentacle suddenly broke through the water and rose into the air like some strange, black tower. Before too long, it fell down, entangling the owner of the giant maw and pulling it back under the water. Sunny lost the feeling in his legs and plopped on the ground, his mouth opened. His whole body was shaking. A few seconds later, the dark sea was calm again, as though nothing has happened. The indifferent waves continued to move silently under the lightless sky. So, it wasn't trying to eat me, he realized, frozen. It was trying to run away. A few minutes later, Sunny was pretty sure that nothing was going to devour him, at least not immediately. With that certainty, he was finally in a state of mind to stop trembling and explore his surroundings a little. The black mass he climbed onto turned out to be a single stone platform of around 12 meters in diameter. Its surface was mostly flat, covered with grooves, and somewhat dry. Due to the regular shape of its edges, it seemed more like something man-made than a natural formation. But then again, here in the dream realm, it was hard to be sure that something man-made was actually made by humans, as opposed to, better not to think about it. The platform wasn't connected to anything, existing as a tiny island in the sea of darkness. There wasn't anything else above the water for as far as Sunny was able to see. After discovering that fact, he also realized something else. It was that he was wet, cold, and completely naked. In his defense, the clothing situation was the last thing one would think about when trying to save themselves from abyssal monsters. Also, it's not like someone was here to witness his stark paleness and private bits. Still, it was sort of cold. Sunny summoned the puppeteer's shroud and watched as dark gray garments covered his body. It even came with a pair of high, soft-soled leather boots. Clad in gray fabric and lusterless leather, he suddenly felt much safer. Not to mention, warm. After that, Sunny sat down in the middle of the platform, as far away from water as he could, and tried to remember the unique characteristic of every explored region of the dream realm he could think of. Unfortunately, none of them matched the starless, dark void. Of course not, he thought with a bit of resentment. Even if some unlucky humans had ever come here, I doubt that they were able to return to the real world alive. Not with those things hiding underwater. Not yet desperate enough to leave the platform and try to swim away in search of land, Sunny decided to wait and see. Maybe something was going to change as time went by. With a soft sigh, he habitually looked for his shadow. However, due to the total darkness that surrounded him, it couldn't really be seen. He just barely felt its presence. This must be a paradise for you, right? All this gloom and not a star in sight. The shadow, of course, did not answer. Anyway, good job earlier. With a nod, Sunny lay down, using his hands as a pillow. Not thinking about much, he stared into the black sky and waited. The sound of the undulating waves was, actually, quite relaxing. After a while, he closed his eyes and listened. Minutes merged together, growing into hours. Suddenly, Sunny caught a slight change in the sound of the sea. It was as though something was shifting. He opened his eyes and noticed that one corner of the sky was slowly turning gray. Soon, a glimpse of a pale sun could be seen rising above the horizon. A new day had come to the starless void. And with it, the dark sea suddenly surged. The black, opaque water suddenly surged and seethed, as though a living creature desperately trying to avoid the pale light of the coming dawn. Sunny slowly rose and, after some thought, carefully approached the edge of the stone platform. Looking down, he blinked and then kneeled to make sure that what he saw wasn't an illusion. The sea seemed to be receding. Slowly at first, and then faster and faster, the water level was dropping. The circular stone formation he had been taking shelter on used to barely protrude out of the waves, but now there were meters and meters of wet rock between him and the restless surface of the sea. As the sun climbed up, the monstrous ebb tide continued. Soon, Sunny found himself standing on the edge of a tall cliff, with a 100-meter drop separating him from the churning waters. Beneath him, the rock formation broadened and changed shape. However, from his vantage point, it was hard to determine what that shape was, exactly. At that time, the dark surface of the water began to be punctured here and there by sharp crimson blades. As it dropped even further, it was as though a crimson forest was slowly rising from the black depths. The trees were made of something resembling coral, growing chaotically into each other and stretching toward the sky. They were colossal in size, with irregular protrusions entwining and merging together, looking monumental and eerie in the black and red reality of the sunlit void. The labyrinth formed by this strange reef stretched as far as Sunny could see, broken here and there by protruding cliffs, sudden chasms, and distant natural features. Half an hour later, utterly shocked, Sunny stared down and realized that the sea was completely gone. If not for the black seaweed left hanging on wet rocks and scarlet pillars of coral, he would even doubt if it was ever there. His small circular island had turned into the peak of a strange, towering, irregularly shaped cliff. Looking down, he felt his head spinning. By then, the night had already fully retreated, letting morning finally take its place. I'm not seeing things, am I? Sunny thought, pinching himself. What the spell was that? Despite the sudden disappearance of the dark sea and its hidden monsters, Sunny was in no rush to climb down from his circular stone platform. Firstly, he felt that if the sea was able to disappear, it was surely able to come back, perhaps at any moment. Secondly, he did not know what dangers the coral labyrinth was hiding. Perhaps there was something even scarier than the owner of the giant tentacle down there. But that did not mean that he wasn't going to explore. Coming back to his spot in the middle of the platform, Sunny sat down and commanded his shadow to separate itself from his body. Then, taking control of it, he approached the edge of the platform and nimbly slid down. Habitually moving from one shadow to another, he began the descent. At this moment, Sunny was glad that shadows had no weight and were not affected by gravity. While the shadow was busy climbing down, Sunny yawned. Say, don't you think that you need a name? Although his shadow was already too far away to hear him, they still could communicate through their shared connection. Of course, the fact that it could did not mean that it would. The shadow was sort of taciturn, mostly because it didn't have vocal cords and was unable to speak. Plus, its temper wasn't that great. How about shameless? No? What about shady? Also no? What about something simpler, like what? Well, do you have suggestions then? All right. We'll shelve this conversation for later. By the time he was done with this short monologue, the shadow had already reached the bottom of the cliff. The range of shadow control was not limitless, but it was just barely enough to explore their nearest surroundings. Entering the labyrinth, Sunny found it to be extremely disorienting and convoluted. The paths between coral pillars were sometimes broad, sometimes narrow. They twisted and turned without any logic, often leading to dead ends or even back to where he started. More than that, some paths entered inside the coral mounds, turning into dark tunnels. The labyrinth was vast and multi-layered, making Sunny's head hurt after multiple fruitless attempts to memorize the layout of the nearest pathways. In the end, he sent the shadow up, forcing it to climb on top of the crimson forest and start jumping from one sharp coral blade to another, knowing full well that he himself would not be able to do the same. Soon, he circled the strange cliff and froze, scared by the sight of what was happening in its shadow. There, the corpse of the giant shark-like creature that had briefly pursued him the previous night was laying on the ground, the pillars of coral around it shattered and broken. More precisely, half of it was there, with grotesque innards spilling out of the terrible wound and stretching far away into the distance. The other half was gone, as though it had never existed. Around the corpse, hundreds of smaller monsters were scurrying, tearing away and devouring its flesh bit by bit. Each of them was about 2.5 meters tall, looking like a weird mix of a demonic crab, a centaur, and a nightmare. They had 4 pairs of long, segmented legs that ended in scythe-like protrusions. At the front, a human-like torso was protruding from the carapace, also clad in thick chitinous armor. The head, if it was even the appropriate word, was situated directly on top of the torso, with no neck in between. It had 2 narrow eye slits and a viscous-looking mouth with several slimy mandibles. Instead of hands, the monsters had 2 enormous pincers. Currently, they were all using those pincers to tear off chunks of meat off the desiccated corpse and stuff them into their mouths. From time to time, a fight for an especially juicy piece of meat would break out, ending up in a few monsters being torn apart and quickly devoured by the victors. Sunny swallowed. Both because the sight of heavily armored, powerful monsters made him nervous and because looking at them feasting, he suddenly felt very hungry. Each of them seems like trouble. And there are hundreds of them. His luck, like always, was awful. At least I don't have to wonder why the labyrinth feels so empty. All the inhabitants are having a party. Feeling a little bit comprehensive about turning his shadows back to the monsters, Sunny commanded it to look back and study the cliff he was taking shelter atop of. Something about it was making him feel uneasy. The shadow turned around and looked up, taking in the sight of the strangely shaped cliff. It took Sunny a few minutes to shift his perspective and recognize it for what it was. That's a finger. That's a hand. That is a sword? He blinked. It's a statue. Indeed, the cliff was man-made. It was an ancient, colossal statue at least 200 meters tall. The scale of it was so massive that it boggled the mind. From what Sunny could see, it depicted a knight clad in an elaborate plate armor, with 7 shining stars carved into his breastplate. In his hands, he was holding a gargantuan sword, pointing it to the ground. However, the most striking thing about it was that the giant stone knight was missing his head. In fact, the roughly circular platform Sunny was standing on turned out to be the top of his neck. And by the looks of it, the head wasn't missing by design, it was as though something, or someone, had violently tore it off at some point in the distant past. Sunny walked around the platform, looking down from all sides, but didn't notice the head lying anywhere near. What on earth is this place? Without any hints to find the answer, he led his shadow back to the giant's neck and settled at the western edge of it, studying the feasting monsters. He didn't move until the sun was about to set. Just as Sunny expected, as soon as the sun touched the horizon, a deafening rumble could be heard coming from somewhere below. The monsters instantly stopped their feast and scurried away, some hiding inside the coral pillars, some simply burying themselves in the soft soil. A few minutes later, the first streams of black water appeared in the labyrinth. Their volume quickly grew, and soon an apocalyptic flood devoured everything around. The sea was returning with the approach of the night. Sunny stared at this unimaginable process, thoughts churning in his head. In an hour, the circular platform was the only thing above the dark waters once again. With an empty stomach and a head full of thoughts, Sunny returned to the center of the platform and sat down. After a while, he beckoned to his shadow and said, "Wake me up if anything happens." Then, he closed his eyes and tried to fall asleep. His consciousness quickly slid into the sweet embrace of darkness, giving Sunny some well-needed rest. In the middle of the night, however, a sudden impulse stirred him awake. Sunny jumped to his feet, his groggy mind full of tense apprehension. He was afraid that the owner of the giant tentacle had come back to finish the job. Or maybe some other horror from the depths had sensed him and decided to snack on human meat. However, the sea was quiet and calm. He didn't hear any abnormalities around the night statue. "What is it?" Sunny whispered, addressing the shadow. The shadow silently pointed him in a particular direction. Turning his head, Sunny squinted. He quickly understood why it was a good idea to wake up. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to see. Out there in the distance, a few kilometers away, a small orange light was shimmering in the darkness. Its reflections were rising and falling with the movement of waves. It was too far away to make out any details, so Sunny just stared at it for a while. Pretty soon, the light disappeared. Other sleepers? Natural phenomenon? Or some monster laying a trap? Memories of nightmarish deepwater creatures immediately came to his mind. Shaking his head, Sunny lay back down and attempted to return to his slumber. However, this time sleep was escaping him. Pangs of hunger were still not unbearable, but slowly becoming more and more intense. The thirst, however, was worse. In the end, he remained awake up until the sun rose again, sending the dark sea in retreat. As soon as the morning came, the pincer monsters crawled back from their hiding spots and rushed to the giant carcass to continue their feast. Sunny watched them for some time and then walked to the opposite side of the platform to take a look in the direction where he had seen the mysterious light the previous night. At a considerable distance from the headless statue, 5 or 6 kilometers away, the ground rose naturally and formed something akin to a hill. On top of that hill, an especially massive coral pillar rose to the sky. From the looks of it, its upper branches were just high enough to stay above water in the night. Various ideas stormed into Sunny's head, but at the end of it, only 2 questions were really important. First of all, would he be able to find the way through the labyrinth and cover that distance during the day? And more importantly, should he even attempt to do it? After all, there was no indication that the source of the mysterious light was something beneficial, as opposed to dreadful and deadly. Not having enough information to make a choice, Sunny settled back to study the monsters. He did, however, send the shadow to investigate as far into the labyrinth as the range of shadow control allowed, hoping to chart at least the beginning of the path that could potentially lead him to that hill. Logically speaking, he was as safe atop the headless statue as he probably could be in this strange place. The only problem was, he was going to die soon because of thirst or hunger. Both problems were solvable if he were to venture down. He could desalinate the seawater in a number of ways taught to him by teacher Julius, with materials that were present pretty much everywhere in the dream realm. He could also prepare traps and hunt a pincer monster to eat. With their massive size, just one of them would be enough to feed him for weeks. He could easily see such a routine, hunting by day, returning to the statue at the approach of the night. It was probably his safest choice. However, this way of doing things lacked one vital element, the potential for improvement. It was well suited for keeping Sunny alive, but had no way of giving him hope. If he was destined to spend the rest of his life in the small area surrounding the headless statue, devouring monsters and trembling at night in fear of being devoured by something bigger in turn, well, he would rather just jump down and end it right now. That pretty much meant that the only choice left for him was to try and reach the source of the orange light. And if Sunny was really trying to attempt it, he had to do it before the pincer monsters were done consuming the giant carcass. That way, at least, the surrounding segment of the labyrinth was going to be free of them. Firm in his choice, Sunny decided to leave the headless statue the next morning. He would spend the rest of today exploring paths through the labyrinth and preparing himself mentally. With that, he closed his eyes and concentrated his perception on the moving shadow. In the night, a sudden storm descended upon the dark sea. Sunny was stirred awake by the shadow in time to prepare himself for the crushing winds and the pelting rain. Usually, rain always put him in a bad mood. But this time he was too thirsty to think about anything except for fresh water. Staying low so as to not be blown over the edge of the platform, Sunny cupped his hands and waited until they became filled with rainwater. Then he raised them to his mouth and greedily drank. Strikes of lightning illuminated everything above the churning sea. If anyone were to see Sunny now, they would have noticed a wide grin on his face. The storm continued to rampage for several hours. Sunny crouched in the middle of the platform, enduring its rage. More than once, a tall wave would crash into the headless knight's neck, threatening to wash him away. But Sunny held tight to the deep grooves in the stone surface of the platform, sticking to it like glue. By morning, when the storm finally dissipated, all of his muscles were sore. But there was no time to waste. As soon as the monsters came back to the carcass, with a few stragglers quickly following behind, he slid over the edge of the platform and began to nimbly climb down. Sunny had to thank wilderness survival classes once again, since he had been taught the basics of rock climbing as well. Teacher Julius was adamant about giving his student a crash course in all possible forms of traversal. Additionally, Sunny had already scouted the optimal way down and memorized the best holds and indentions to grab onto with the help of his shadow. Soon, his feet finally touched the ground. Despite the fact that leaving the safety of the headless statue was going to put him in considerable danger, Sunny instantly felt his mood improving. Remaining passive for the last couple of days did not suit his character well. Now, even if his plan were to end in failure, at least he was going to go down doing something that he had decided to do. Trying and failing was better than not trying at all. The black mud was deep enough to slow him down, but not to the extent he had been afraid of. With some practice, Sunny was soon able to walk at an acceptable speed. What's more, as long as he stuck to the shadows, his steps were light and silent, producing no squelching noises from the mud. He headed for one of the paths that were supposed to lead him to the distant hill and entered the cool shade of the crimson labyrinth. Immediately, a strange feeling enveloped his mind. It was as though the world beyond the labyrinth did not exist anymore, and all that was left were its twisting, dark paths. This thing almost seems endless. Shaking his head, Sunny sent the shadow to scout ahead, hoping to be notified of any latent danger in advance, and began to move forward. His life now depended on whether or not he would reach the distant hill before the sun began to set. He didn't even want to think about what would happen if he were still inside the labyrinth once the dark sea came back in an unstoppable flood. The shadow moved ahead of him, not meeting any hurdles. Sometimes it would climb high to scout the direction of different paths, allowing Sunny to choose the optimal route most of the time. However, he still had to backtrack a considerable distance once or twice, ending up either in a dead end or on a path leading in the wrong direction. Despite that, everything seemed to be going smoothly. Sunny even had time to carefully study the interior of the labyrinth, noticing more details of its composition, as well as a frightening amount of unrecognizable bones hiding in the mud beneath his feet. Because of how well things were going, he lowered his guard a little. His arrogance was also to blame. With his extensive preparations and skillful control of the Shadow Scout, Sunny subconsciously patted himself on the shoulder and assumed that everything was going to be fine. That's why, when the mud directly in front of him started to move, he was a fraction of a second late to react. In the next moment, a massive pincer shot out of the ground and tore through the air, threatening to cut his body in half with one crushing strike. Crap! This was the only thought in Sunny's head as he awkwardly fell backward, allowing the pincer to close right in front of his face with a loud clack. The jagged, chitinous blades were so close that he could clearly see bits of mud sticking to their surface. Sunny landed on his back, narrowly avoiding the unexpected strike. The good thing was that he managed to avoid being injured or even killed. The bad thing was that he was sprawled on the ground, unable to quickly create distance between him and the attacker. The massive pincer was still hovering above. Just as this realization dawned on Sunny, he desperately rolled to the side. In the next moment, the pincer lunged down, sending small tremors through the mud. If not for his quick reaction, Sunny's chest would have been caved in by that blow. He was just beginning to stand up when the pincer swiped sideways. Luckily, Sunny was ready. Instead of trying to dodge or block the attack, he went with it, letting the pincer collide with his outstretched hands and cushioning the blow. As his arms screamed in pain, Sunny used the force of the blow and allowed his body to be sent flying through the air. This way, at least, he would get out of the pincer's range. He might not have been taught how to fight, but one thing he knew very well was how to fall. Instead of breaking his neck or having the breath beaten out of him by the landing, he braced his body and nimbly rolled before stopping some distance away from the ambushing monster. I take it back. Sunny though, remembering his sarcastic critique of heroes' battle rolls. Rolling is an integral part of any respectable monster fighting technique. Then, he looked up, trying to ascertain the situation. In front of him, the attacker had finally shown itself. It burrowed from under the mud, casting a vast shadow over kneeling Sunny. Its tiny eyes were full of rage, hunger, and malice. It was one of the pincer monsters he had spent so much time observing. Towering over him at almost 3 meters in height, the bulky creature moved its mandibles and produced a jarring, piercing screech. Why aren't you devouring the giant carcass with the rest of your buddies, you crab bastard? However, the answer to Sunny's indignant plea was rather obvious. The monster seemed to be in a rather bad shape. Half of its 8 scythe-like legs were broken, and there were cracks in its thick carapace, each oozing with viscous azure blood. Additionally, he was missing one of its 2 pincer arms, which seemed to have been torn off entirely at the shoulder. If not for this pathetic state, the creature would have had no need to hide in the mud, hoping to catch easy prey. It could have just followed the other monsters and joined on the feast. Sunny was just unlucky to stumble directly upon its ambush. He had relied too much on the scouting abilities of his shadow, forgetting that it wasn't much more observant than an awakened human. It was also weightless and inaudible. That's why the monster did not react when the shadow had passed over its trap a minute earlier. On the other hand, Sunny could also consider himself lucky. By the same logic, he would not have been able to dodge the creature's sudden attack if not for its crippled, slowed state. But pondering on his luck could wait for later. Right now, Sunny had a far more pressing thing to do. Namely, try to survive. Get back here, he ordered the shadow and jumped to the side. In the next second, the space he occupied a moment before was torn apart by the attacking monster. Its heavy pincer crashed into the side of a coral pillar, sending crimson shards flying in every direction. Sunny caught his balance and continued moving. He was hoping that the bulky, heavily armored, wounded creature would not be able to match his speed, but unfortunately, it turned out to be surprisingly agile. Its scythe-like legs pierced the mud behind him, and the pincer was already flying through the air again, threatening to decapitate the young man at any second. Sunny ducked, dodging the pincer, and finally caught a second of reprieve. His eyes darted around, desperately searching for something to use as a weapon. Almost instantly, he noticed a long, smooth, sharp bone left behind by some unknown creature sticking from the mud. Without slowing down, he bent down and grabbed the bone, pulling it out with one forceful tug. The bone was almost 1.5 meters long, ending in a narrow, sharp tip. It was almost like a spear. The problem was, even with the added length of this makeshift spear, Sunny's range of attack was still shorter than the monster's. He also doubted that it was capable of piercing the hard carapace. In short, he had to get close and aim for one of the cracks in the creature's armor. However, he didn't dare to. At that short of a distance, the monster could easily crush him into a paste by using just its weight and hulking frame. A crazy idea entered Sunny's mind. A bit shocked, he momentarily couldn't decide whether it was the product of audacity or foolishness. Either way, he wasn't insane enough to actually consider it. At that moment, the pincer lashed out again. This time, Sunny was a little late to evade, and as a result, a sharp pain pierced his left leg. It was grazed by the edge of the pincer. The puppeteer's shroud held, not allowing the monster to draw blood, but the force of the impact was enough to throw Sunny tumbling to the ground. There was no time to recover. As his eyes opened wide, Sunny understood that it was time to act crazy. So, instead of trying to dodge, he stopped moving and allowed the monster to grab him across his torso with the pincer. Immediately, a terrible pressure descended on his ribs. Sunny felt as though he was going to be split apart, but his armor, received from defeating an awakened tyrant, resisted the crushing bite of the monster's pincer. Every muscle in his body tensed, delaying the moment when his insides would be turned into mush. In the next second, Sunny's shadow fell from above, wrapping itself around the puppeteer's shroud. With the protective properties of the armor enhanced, he was able to better resist the pincer's pulverizing embrace. Sunny and the monster appeared to be at an impasse. The young man couldn't free himself from the monster's grip, while the monster could not kill the prey by cutting it in halves with its pincer. They stared at each other. Then, an insane fire ignited in the creature's eyes. It clicked its mandibles and raised Sunny in the air, bringing him closer to its mouth, obviously intent on biting his head off. Why is everyone trying to eat me? Am I that tasty? Sunny didn't struggle as the monster brought him close to its mandibles. He knew he only had one chance to live. In the last moment, Sunny allowed the shadow to flow from puppeteer's shroud onto the sharp bone he was still clenching in his hand. Then, he gathered all his strength, leaned forward and thrust the bone forward with as much power as he could. Guided by his hand, the dark bone spear shot forward and pierced through the creature's tiny eye, sinking in deep. The other eye of the monster narrowed. Gritting his teeth from the unbearable pain in his ribs, Sunny twisted the bone, trying to do as much damage to the creature's brain as possible. For a couple of seconds, nothing happened. Then, he felt the pressure on his body diminishing. The pincer opened, letting Sunny fall down. As he hit the mood, the hulking monster crashed to the ground, too. The bone spear was still sticking from its head, bathed in the streams of azure liquid. Sunny moaned and drew in a raspy, painful breath. You have slain an awakened beast, carapace scavenger. You have received a memory, azure blade. Your shadow grows stronger. Sunny was sprawled in the mud, trying to catch his breath. The subtle voice of the spell echoed in his ears. Your shadow grows stronger. Immediately, he felt a slight change. His body grew a little bit stronger, his vision a little sharper, his skin a little smoother. The change was minimal, but apparent. What was that? He had a guess, and it was easy to confirm. Sunny summoned the runes. Shadow fragments, 14/1000. Previously, he only had 12 of the mysterious shadow fragments, with no knowledge on how to acquire more. Now it seemed that the process was automatic. He only had to kill an enemy to absorb a part of their shadow and enhance his own core. More than that, the number of fragments he was able to receive wasn't directly correlated to the number of slain enemies. After a bit of thinking, Sunny came to a preliminary conclusion: dormant soul cores gave him 1 fragment, while awakened ones gave 2. However, only enemies he defeated directly, more or less, counted. Killing the Mountain King's larva, a dormant beast, had given him 1 shadow fragment. Finishing off the veteran slaver, a dormant human, another. Mountain King itself was an awakened tyrant, which meant that it had 5 awakened cores. With each giving Sunny 2 shadow fragments, he ended up with a total of 12. And now, after killing the carapace scavenger, he had 14. Interestingly, he didn't receive any fragments from the deaths of Shifty, Scholar and Hero, even though they perished as a result of his machinations. It seems he had to finish an enemy off with his own 2 hands to absorb a part of their shadow. Well, or at least by summoning an ancient dead god. The process was quite similar to how normal awakened increased their power, with the only difference being that the steps of extracting and consuming the corresponding material, soul shards, were skipped in favor of instant absorption. That meant that shadow fragments could not be stored, and subsequently could not be bought or traded. He won't have an opportunity to receive them as a reward for completing missions, providing services or selling various spoils. If Sunny wanted to grow stronger, his only option was to fight and kill. No peaceful life for me, I guess. Previously, Sunny thought that he at least had the choice to choose a relatively safe path. Many Awakened never left the confines of human citadels and never faced nightmare creatures, choosing instead to perform various jobs in the dream realm just as they would in the real world. They received payments in the form of soul shards, which were simultaneously the fuel of one's progression and the universal currency inside the citadels. Sunny was never set on pursuing such a life, but not even having a choice was sort of irritating. Luckily, there was a bright side, too. Without the need to use soul shards to strengthen his core, he would be able to spend everything he earns freely and without concern. After all, after he kills an enemy and absorbs the shadow fragments, the soul shard would still be there, ready to be collected and exchanged for something Sunny might need in the future. That would effectively make him twice as efficient in terms of earning and spending, which was not a small advantage. Additionally, there was the matter of the shadow core. Since both Sunny and his shadow were tied to it, strengthening the core would not only increase Sunny's power, but also enhance the shadow. So, if he were to use it to further empower himself, the actual effect would be stacked, producing a twofold enhancement. So, for each shadow fragment he collected, Sunny would actually be able to rip twice as much benefit as an awakened would from a soul shard. Not bad. Not bad at all. Ah, the future was bright. Provided he survives and gets the opportunity to even have a future, of course. Sitting up, Sunny moved his eyes and found the cluster of runes describing his memories. Azure Blade, had he finally gotten a weapon? Memory, Azure Blade. Memory rank, Awakened. Memory type, Weapon. Memory description, on this forgotten shore, only steel remembers. Huh. Interesting. Not very informative, but interesting. Sunny summoned his new weapon, and a sharp, light sword immediately appeared in his hand. It was about a meter long, including the handle. The blade was straight and single-edged, ending in an angular tip. It was forged out of azure steel, with a beautiful layered pattern. Deep inside the steel, white sparks could be seen. The crossguard was minimalistic and simple, offering almost no protection to the wielder's hands. If Sunny knew his way around cold weapons, he would have called it a Tang Dao. However, he had no idea about such things. All he could gather was that the blade was single-edged, which meant that it was probably meant for slashing and cutting as opposed to piercing, and that the handle was long enough to accommodate 2 hands. Also, the sword was pretty. He summoned the shadow and made it wrap itself around the azure blade. Immediately, the steel became bluish-black, with a scattering of white sparks. It looked like a starlit night sky. Sunny stood up and waved the sword a couple of times, getting accustomed to its weight. The sharp edge whistled as it cut the air. Well, now I finally look like a real awakened. After that, he cast a gaze at the corpse of the carapace scavenger and grimaced. This part was not going to be pleasant. After some time, he managed to break open the cracked carapace and cut away a few strips of tender, pink meat. He also did not forget to extract the radiant crystal from the beast's chest, the soul shard. Without much hope, he tried to absorb the shard, remembering how it was supposed to be done. Just as he expected, nothing happened. They're really of no direct use to me. With a shrug, Sunny places the shard and the meat in a makeshift rucksack he weaved from black seaweed and looked at the sun. The day was still young. He still had a good chance of making it to the distant hill before the sea came back. However, his left leg was banged up in the fight with the scavenger beast, so walking wasn't as easy as it was before. He gritted his teeth and began limping. Hours passed. Due to his bruises and increased vigilance, Sunny's progress slowed down considerably. He was sweating and grinding his teeth, feeling pain with each step. What's worse, the further he reached into the labyrinth, the more confusing and entangled the paths became. Even with the shadow's help, he constantly had to backtrack and struggled to move in the right direction. Crap. If nothing changed, Sunny would not reach his goal. Which meant that he'll be crushed to death by the returning sea. Not allowing himself to think about dying, Sunny tried to walk faster. However, he couldn't be too hasty, making a wrong turn would have taken precious minutes away from him, so he had to choose the way carefully. Additionally, missing to notice another ambush could end his life directly. Curses! Just when he was beginning to feel desperate, his shadow suddenly saw something that momentarily sent Sunny into a stupor. Some distance further down the path, beyond a few turns, the corals widened, creating a small clearing. And in the middle of that clearing, someone was walking across the mud. The first thing Sunny saw was fair skin, a lot of skin. The tall, lithe girl was only dressed in a makeshift skirt and a crude brassiere, both made out of seaweed. However, it didn't seem to bother her. With a calm expression, she stopped and looked back. The wind was playing with her short silver hair. It was Nightfall, the changing star. In one hand, she was holding the end of a strange golden rope. And on the other end of the rope, Kasha, the blind girl, was carefully following behind. Gray sky above, black mud below, an endless sea of crimson in between. On this dreamlike backdrop, two beautiful girls were walking across the labyrinth. One was delicate and fragile, with blonde hair and cerulean, aimless eyes. She was dressed in a simple tunic, with leather sandals on her feet and a cloak the color of sea waves draped around her shoulders. The other was tall and lithe. She had silky silver hair and clear, gray eyes. Her revealing clothes were crudely made out of black seaweed, leaving her fair skin and athletic build exposed. She was poised, alert, and barefoot. A golden rope connected two girls together. Wow! What a sight! Sunny thought. He suddenly regretted that he was not an artist. The picture just begged to be made into a painting. Wait, why am I thinking about that? People. I found people. His heart skipped a bit. If Nightfall and Kasha were here, then the orange light from before, most likely, had something to do with them. Which meant that they knew how to get to the tall hill. Which meant that Sunny didn't have to be crushed to death by the high tide. So what do I do now? He wasn't the best at ingratiating himself to other people. In fact, he was the polar opposite, people usually instinctively avoided him. And that was in normal circumstances. This time, however, he had spent a whole of 4 weeks making sure that everyone in the academy hated his guts. Good job, Sunny. Still, he was at least useful. In this situation, an additional body was already a great boon when facing hungry monsters. And he wasn't just anyone, his ability to scout ahead alone was worth a lot. Surely they'll understand that, right? With a heavy sigh, Sunny stepped into shadows and hurried to the clearing. He reached it in a minute or so, hiding and observing the two girls before making a final decision. Helping herself with the wooden staff, blind Kasha slowly approached the middle of the clearing and extended her hand, finding Nightfall and touching her on the shoulder. Why did you stop? Nightfall supported the blind girl and glanced at the sky. It's getting late. An awkward pause hung between two girls. After some time, Kasha asked. So you think we should turn back? Nightfall blinked and cleared her throat. Yes. Sunny was a bit amused by their exchange. What is she, a strong silent type? Then he returned to his dilemma and grimaced. How do I approach them? Damn, why is this so hard? It's not like I'm trying to ask them out on a date. I mean, one of them, both of them? What am I thinking about? Just go and say hi. But then, if he suddenly appeared out of the shadows, not at all like a creep, how high was the probability of them getting spooked and attacking him before noticing that he was not a monster? Wait, why would they, to hell with this? Deciding on the safest approach, Sunny commanded his shadow to abandon its hiding place and move to a spot where Nightfall could clearly see it. He could clearly sense the shadow rolling its eyes as it obeyed the order. As soon as the shadow started to move, Nightfall suddenly snapped her hand sideways. Immediately, a long sword appeared in it, cutting the air as it assumed a defensive position. Before the shadow could even take 2 steps out of its hiding spot, it was already pierced by Changing Star's gray eyes. The shadow froze. It seemed a bit startled. Kasha took a step back. Neff? What is it? Nightfall didn't answer immediately, carefully observing the shadow. Then she simply said, There's a shadow. Kasha's doll-like face paled. A shadow? Scavengers? The tall girl tilted her head a little. No. It's a human shadow. This was clearly not what Kasha expected to hear. With an expression of surprise, she asked. A human shadow? What is it doing? Nightfall hesitated. After a while, she answered in a flat tone. It's waving at us. After a whole minute of silence, Kasha finally found the words to react. What? I said, it's waving. Yes, I know. I mean, why is it doing that? Nightfall opened her mouth, then closed it again. I don't know. Maybe it's a distraction to lure us into a trap. At this point, Sunny decided that it was time to talk. He inhaled deeply, then said in a friendly tone. Actually, I just sent it ahead to make sure that you don't stab me with that sword before realizing that I'm human. Immediately, Nephice turned her head, pinpointing the exact location where Sunny was hiding in a blotch of shadows. Her sword slightly shifted, aiming at the new threat. If you're human, why are hiding in the shadows like a creep? Goddamn, I'm not a creep. Sunny's hoked. But his flaw was merciless. He had to provide an answer, and a truthful one at that. I mean, you're changing star Nephice. To be honest, I'm a little afraid. Nephice did not answer. Because of her hard-to-read face, it was almost impossible to determine whether she believed him or not. However, he included her true name in his answer for a reason. If he was some monster pretending to be human, he wouldn't have known it. Luckily, Kasha was more expressive. Are you the boy who sat with me in the cafeteria? Sunny smiled. Meanwhile, Nephice glanced at the blind girl. Do you know him? Kasha nodded. I recognize his voice. His name is Sunless. He was in second-to-last place in the rankings, right above me. The tall girl frowned, as if trying to remember. Then she asked. The pervert? The smile disappeared from Sunny's face, replaced by exasperation. Oh, come on. Kasha hesitated and didn't answer. Hey, I'm not really a pervert, you know. I just, said a few things. To a few girls. It was all a misunderstanding. Nephice was silent for a few seconds, and then, finally, dismissed her sword. Okay. You can come out. Sunny limped out of the shadows, summoning his own back. It flowed to his feet and reattached itself, visibly shaking. The bastard was laughing at him. Stopping a few meters away from Nephice, he raised his hands, showing that he didn't mean the girls any harm. Changing Star gave him an inquisitive look. What happened to you? She was referring to his limp, bruises, and overall banged-up look. Sunny sighed. Carapace scavenger. Nephice raised an eyebrow. You managed to get away alive? You bet I did. Sunny subconsciously straightened his back. I didn't get away. I killed it. To prove his point, he gestured at his rucksack, full of delicious monster meat. Nephice looked him over again, re-evaluating her opinion of him. Now, there were hints of approval in her eyes. Carapace scavengers were only beasts, but they were still awakened. With the addition of their mighty physique and natural armor, defeating one was not an easy feat for any sleeper, who all had a dormant core. Let alone someone from the very bottom of the ranking list. Come to think of it, it was even a bit too outstanding. Sunny lowered his eyes. It was already wounded. Nephice shrugged. A kill is a kill. You did well. After that, she fell silent, as though not planning to say anything else. Sunny also wasn't sure what to say. Luckily, Kasha came to the rescue. Are you seriously injured? He shook his head. No, it's just that my ribs and leg are bruised. I'll be fine in a day or two. My armor is pretty resilient. He wasn't worried that they might be tempted to kill him to get the puppeteer's shroud. That was because memories were destroyed at the moment of their owner's death. So they only could be transferred voluntarily by a living person. Well, there was always torture and blackmail. But he doubted that any one of the two beautiful girls would stoop to that. Sunny cleared his throat. Before stumbling on the scavenger, I was heading for the tall hill with the massive coral pillar on top. But after the fight, my speed decreased. Now I'm worried about not making it in time. Do you perhaps know the way? Kasha smiled. Actually, we spend the last days on that hill. We were just about to go back. Nephice didn't say anything, looking at the sky. Sunny licked his lips. Well, can I come with you? They're not going to say no, right? The blind girl turned her head to her companion, a clear question written on her face. Nephice lowered her eyes, staring at Sunny. After a while, she said. No. What? Problem. No problem. What's wrong with you, princess? Can't you speak faster? Feeling his heart beating wildly in his chest, Sunny smiled. Well, all right.
Thank you so much. Visit us more for more novels, please. Like, subscribe to our channel.